A suburban street, midday sun blazing. A uniformed code enforcement officer stands stiffly, clipboard in hand, squinting at the fence. The protagonist, arms crossed, watches with calm defiance. Just feet away, Mrs. Calloway, the self-important HOA president, has her hands on her hips, seething. You've got some real nerve, you know that? For what exactly? Oh, don't play dumb with me. This ugly fence has violated our HOA regulations since you moved in. I've warned you multiple times. And yet here we are. The code enforcement officer clears his throat, shuffling through documents. The tension thickens. A few nosy neighbors peek through their blinds, pretending they aren't watching. I received your complaints, yes, but I don't recall agreeing to remove it. Mrs. Calloway snaps her fingers, stepping closer. Then let me make it clearer. This neighborhood has standards. And your goddamn fence. It's an eyesore. A disgrace. We don't tolerate rule breakers. So, I called in professionals to deal with it. She waves dramatically at the code enforcement officer. Right. So, under the HOA's bylaws, all fences must conform to. Hold on. Are you citing bylaws? Good. Because I have some paperwork of my own. A moment of stunned silence. Mrs. Calloway's face twitches, her confidence momentarily flickering. She expected resistance, but not preparation. Oh, please. You can dig up whatever bullshit paperwork you want. It doesn't change the fact that you're violating the rules. And I'll make damn sure you pay for it. Funny thing about that, before you keep running your mouth, maybe you should listen to what your professionals say. The code enforcement officer looks up sharply. Actually, there's something strange here. Mrs. Calloway whips her head around, eyes narrowing. What the hell do you mean, strange? The officer pulls out an official city document and flips through the pages. His brows furrow. This can't be right. Where did you say this fence came from? I didn't. Mrs. Calloway grows red in the face. Oh, cut the smug act and explain yourself. All right. Since you're so desperate to know this fence, it's not mine. Never was. A hushed murmur spreads among the gathering neighbors. Bullshit. The code enforcement officer clears his throat, straightening up. Actually, according to city records, this fence was installed as part of a municipal project. 20 years ago. It's public infrastructure. A dead silence falls. Mrs. Calloway's eyes widen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That's impossible. That's not. Oh, but it is. Mrs. Calloway snatches the papers from the officer's hands, scanning them frantically. The neighbors whisper in growing amusement and curiosity. Wait, so they've been harassing them over a city fence? This is getting good. Mrs. Calloway's hands shake as she grips the document. This has to be a fucking mistake. It's not. A long, heavy beat. Mrs. Calloway's face contorts with barely contained rage. You little piece of shit. You think you've won. This isn't over. She whirls on her heel, storming off. The neighbors burst into hushed chatter, some shaking their heads, others chuckling. The protagonist watches her go, exhaling slowly. They weren't sure how deep this fight would go, but now they had the upper hand. Oh, it's not over. But I'm damn sure ready for round 2. Mark barely had time to grab a beer from the fridge before his phone buzzed. HOA fine notice $500 for failure to maintain lawn. The timestamp? 5 minutes ago. That fat bastard, Mark muttered, gripping his phone. Vaughn wasn't bluffing. He was escalating. Mark threw open his laptop and logged into the HOA portal. He pulled up the community guidelines and read them line by line. Nowhere did it define acceptable lawn length. It was all subjective and left to the discretion of the HOA board. In other words, Vaughn's dictatorship. A hard knock at the door made him sigh. This asshole again. But it wasn't Vaughn. It was Sarah Green. She was a neighbor, quiet, and kept to herself, but right now, she looked pissed. He got you too, she snapped, stepping inside uninvited. Mark raised an eyebrow. I take it you're not here for a cup of sugar? She held up her fine notice, same charge, same bullshit reasoning. This is the 3rd one in 2 months, she said. And I know for a fact that Jerry across the street hasn't mowed his lawn in 3 weeks, but he hasn't gotten a single damn fine. Mark exhaled sharply. Selective enforcement. Vaughn's targeting people. Sarah nodded. And I have a theory of why. Do you know who's been fined the most? She pulled out a crumpled list. The names were all the same. People who had spoken up against Vaughn in meetings. People who had refused to vote in his favor. People who didn't kiss his ass. That motherfucker, Mark muttered. Sarah folded her arms. So, what do we do about it? Mark smirked. We start playing dirty. The first step was documentation. Mark spent the next week watching, photographing, and recording. He documented every unkempt lawn Vaughn ignored, every favor he gave his friends, and every time he bullied someone into compliance. Then, the HOA's landscaping records caught his eye. Vaughn had personally approved every contract for lawn care. Who was getting those contracts? Mark dug deeper, and that's when he found that Vaughn's cousin owned the landscaping company. Holy shit, Mark muttered, staring at the evidence. This wasn't about lawns. It was about money. Vaughn wasn't just abusing his power, he was funneling HOA funds to his own family. Mark grinned. Gotcha, you corrupt piece of shit. He shared the findings with Sarah, and they started quietly spreading the word. They can find us, Mark told the neighbors, but they can't find all of us. One by one, neighbors started pushing back, ignoring fines, filing complaints, whispering at HOA meetings. Vaughn noticed, and Vaughn hated it. That's when things got ugly. Mark got another fine, then another, then a formal violation warning. They're trying to get me evicted, he told Sarah, tossing another notice onto the growing pile. Sarah nodded grimly. He's scared. But Vaughn wasn't just throwing fines now. One night, Mark's trash cans disappeared. Another night, his mailbox was mysteriously knocked over. And then his car tires were slashed. That was the last straw. Mark didn't call the cops. He called his lawyer. I need everything Vaughn's done documented and prepped for legal action, Mark said. The lawyer chuckled. You got dirt on him? Mark smirked. Oh, buddy, I got an entire fucking landfill. The legal gears started turning. At the same time, Mark and Sarah began gathering the community. Neighbors spoke out in private group chats. HOA meetings became war zones. Mark wasn't just fighting back anymore. He was leading a fucking rebellion. And Vaughn, he still had no idea about the nuclear bomb Mark was about to drop on him. The next morning, Mark woke up to a bright orange notice slapped across his front door. Failure to comply will result in HOA legal action. You've got to be fucking kidding me, Mark growled. He ripped the paper down and stormed outside only to find Vaughn and his two bored lackeys standing at the edge of his driveway, arms folded, smirking. Morning, Mark, Vaughn said, smug as ever. Enjoying the fine collection. I figured we'd just cut to the chase and speed things along. Mark clenched his jaw. You really want to push this, huh? He said. Vaughn laughed. Oh, we're past pushing, buddy. This is a bulldozer. You're looking at formal HOA litigation if you don't shut the fuck up and follow the rules. Mark took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. Are you sure about that? He said. Because if you come after me legally, that means we get to go to court. And in court, all sorts of shit becomes public record. Like, say your little landscaping scam. Vaughn's smirk twitched. Just for a second. Bullseye. Mark saw it. Vaughn wasn't confident anymore. Walk away, Mark, Vaughn said, his tone sharper now. This is bigger than you. Mark grinned. Yeah, well, I'm bigger than you think. Vaughn's face darkened. He turned, barking at his board members. Let's go. He's not worth the time. But as Vaughn walked away, Mark saw the way his shoulders were tensed. The HOA wasn't used to being challenged, and they were starting to sweat. This wasn't just a Mark problem. This was a neighborhood rebellion. Sarah called him that night. Are you seeing the shit? Oh, I see it, Mark said. Vaughn's losing control. But then came the counterattack. The next morning, the Facebook group changed its settings. Comments disabled. Posts disappearing. And then an official HOA email blasted out to the whole neighborhood. We understand that some residents are frustrated with recent enforcement actions. However, the rules exist for a reason. If certain individuals continue spreading false information and encouraging noncompliance, the HOA will take legal action. Mark laughed out loud. Did this motherfucker just threaten to sue the entire neighborhood? Sarah sighed. Yep. He's panicking. Good, Mark said. That means it's time to crank up the pressure. Vaughn looked like a man watching his execution. The HOA president stood frozen on his porch, sweat pooling at his collar, as more neighbors gathered. A crowd was forming, dozens of people clutching copies of Mark's flyers. The proof of Vaughn's corruption. The evidence was out. The neighborhood was pissed. "What's the matter, Rich?" Mark called out, his voice dripping with amusement. "You always have plenty to say when you're threatening fines. Check out your tongue now." The murmur of the crowd swelled into open hostility. "I got one of those bullshit fines last week. You're paying your own family with our money? You lying son of a bitch. You told me the fines were for the good of the neighborhoods." Vaughn's eyes darted, searching for an escape, but there wasn't one. His power, his smug iron grip over the HOA was cracking. Then, a new voice cut through the chaos. "This meeting is out of order." It was Vaughn's lapdog, Nancy Green, the HOA's treasurer. Her heels clacked aggressively as she shoved her way through the crowd, waving a clipboard like a battle axe. "None of this is official. None of this is on the agenda. This is harassment." "Shut the fuck up, Nancy," someone snapped from the crowd. Nancy's Botoxed forehead twitched. Mark stepped forward, unfazed. "It is official. The HOA bylaws say that if a majority of homeowners request an emergency meeting, we get one. And judging by the number of people here, I'd say we have more than enough." Nancy paled. Vaughn was out of moves. Mark grinned. "All right, Rich. Let's talk." In front of everyone, Vaughn swallowed hard. Nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. It was time for the kill. Mark held up the folder, thick, packed with documents. "First question, Rich. How much money has the HOA paid to your cousin's landscaping company?" Vaughn's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't have to answer that." "No." Mark smirked. "That's funny, because I already did the math. Over the past 4 years, the HOA has paid your cousin's company nearly $200,000. And guess what? We only had 3 other bids for those contracts, and your cousin's was the most expensive every single time." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah, who had been standing behind Mark, shoved her stack of documents into the air. "That's called self-dealing. You corrupt," she shouted. "It's illegal." Vaughn's face twitched. "This is slander." "No, Rich," Mark said smoothly, pulling out another paper. "This is a financial audit request, signed by 24 homeowners. And guess what? It's already been submitted to the county. By law, you have to turn over every HOA financial record in the next 10 days. More angry voices erupted from the crowd. "You've been stealing from us? No wonder you're always finding people. You needed the cash. You slimy piece of shit." Vaughn's breathing turned shallow. He was drowning. Mark wasn't done. "But let's talk about something else, Rich," he continued, flipping to another page. "Your cousin isn't just overcharging for lawn care, is he?" Silence. Vaughn's jaw clenched. Mark held up a blurry photo. A picture of a man in a hazmat suit, spraying something on a lawn. "You know what's funny?" Mark said, tapping the image. "I couldn't figure out why my grass started dying after the last required HOA treatment. Then I started asking around. Turns out, a bunch of other people had the same problem." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "So I did some digging," Mark continued. "And guess what I found?" He pulled out another document. "The chemicals your cousin's company has been using? Banned by the EPA 3 years ago. Toxic to humans. Dangerous as hell." The crowd erupted. Nancy stumbled back in horror. Vaughn looked like he was about to fucking puke. "You're lying," Vaughn shouted, his voice cracking. "Oh," Mark said, holding up his phone. "Because I have an email from the county health department confirming it, and they're sending out an inspector this week. So, good luck explaining that one." The crowd wasn't just angry now. They were out for blood. By the time Vaughn peeled out of the neighborhood in his overpriced SUV, the damage was done. Mark stood at the center of the chaos, watching as neighbors flooded the street, buzzing like a goddamn revolution just took place. People were talking, shouting, shaking their heads in disbelief. "Did you see his fucking face?" someone cackled. "Dude looked like he shit himself," another added. "That bastard stole from us, poisoned our goddamn lawns, and thought he could walk away clean?" The rage had transformed. It was no longer fear. It was power. Mark didn't even have to organize it. It just happened. By midnight, a petition to dissolve the current HOA board had been signed by over 80% of the neighborhood. By morning, it was submitted to the city. By the end of the week, Vaughn and his cronies were legally removed. And Mark made damn sure the local news got every single shady document, financial record, and chemical violation Vaughn ever tried to bury. The headlines hit hard. Then came the real kicker. Vaughn wasn't just forced to resign. He was under investigation. The county opened a full audit. The EPA got involved. The fines weren't just reversed, they were turned against him. Mark's $500 fine? Vaughn now owed nearly $50,000 in penalties. Sarah showed up at Mark's doorstep, grinning like she won the fucking lottery. You know he put his house up for sale this morning, right? Mark took a sip of his coffee, savoring it. Guess he should have mowed his lawn. The next HOA meeting was historic. Vaughn's seat was an empty, poetic, silent victory. In his place, a group of newly elected board members, all voted in by the same people Vaughn tried to screw over. And Mark, he sat in the back, arms crossed, just watching. Sarah leaned over. You could have run, you know. Hell no, Mark muttered. I did my job. I'm not about to waste my free time arguing about mailbox colors. She laughed. Fair enough. The new president and no-nonsense retired lawyer named Greg Saunders cleared his throat. All right, folks, Greg said, leveling the room with his no-bullshit gaze. First order of business. We're wiping every fine issued under Vaughn's tenure. Every single one. The room erupted in applause. Mark smirked. Checkmate. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't living in fear. No more bullshit fines. No more power-hungry assholes shaking people down for cash. And as Mark stepped outside, feeling the sun on his face, he realized something. He liked his neighborhood again.